Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Perth, Western Australia. A young unmarried couple sat with a decision to make. Vivian Cooke, a local shop assistant, and his girlfriend, Christine Edgar, a young woman originally from Scotland, had found out that Christine was pregnant. Times being what they were, both Vivian and Christine felt like their hands were tied and quickly got married so that their child would not be born out of wedlock. But their marriage was far from a match made in heaven. Vivian had a mean and violent streak, and when his first child, Eric Edgar Cooke, came into the world in February 1931, that violent streak only grew worse. Vivian was known to drink heavily, and when he drank, he often beat his wife Christine. When Eric became old enough to start to try to protect his mother from his father, he beat Eric as well. Christine took to sleeping in the staff room in her workplace to try to avoid going home to her husband. And even though he was still only a child, Eric took to the streets to do the exact same thing, avoid his father. He sometimes chose to sleep under the house or just stayed up all night walking around the neighborhood so that he didn't have to go home. But to say that Eric chose to stay out on the streets isn't entirely accurate either. He'd been born with a cleft lip, which had left him with a speech impediment and a slight disfiguration on his face, even after 2 surgeries. The other children in his school and the neighborhood bullied Eric because of these differences, meaning that Eric had no friends and nowhere to go when he was out of the house, avoiding his father. Occasionally, he'd be picked up or dropped off in an orphanage or foster home, but he'd always find himself back at the same crossroads. Risk getting beaten up at home or rough it on the streets. The difficult situation at home and the constant bullying at school turned Eric into a quiet and withdrawn child. He did well enough in his lessons, but emotionally he was becoming more and more unstable, and he became prone to angry outbursts. As he grew, so did the severity and the results of Vivian's beatings, and Eric was often hospitalized for head injuries. Unfortunately, the side effects of those injuries also seemed to linger even after Eric had been discharged. He became clumsy and unstable on his feet, which led to even more accidents outside of the ones from the beatings. He then started complaining about severe headaches and sometimes even blacking out, leading some people to believe that Eric had undiagnosed brain damage. Others argue that his growing number of accidents were actually a result of his repressed desire to take his own life. When he was only 14, Eric left school so he could start working to help support this family. Vivian often drank away the money that they earned, so Christine would find extra work cooking and cleaning around the neighborhood. But she still had mouths to feed at home. She and Vivian had 2 more children after Eric. Realizing that his mother needed financial help with the siblings, Eric found a job as a delivery boy at a local store. He'd then hand over his weekly pay to his mother to help keep the household going, but none of that actually addressed the main problem at home, his father. By the age of 17, Eric was spending more and more nights out on the streets to avoid Vivian and getting into more and more trouble. He tested the waters with petty crimes and vandalism, but he got into things deep when he burned down a local church. He'd auditioned to join the church's choir, and after they turned him down, he came back in the middle of the night and set the church on fire. He was arrested and served 18 months in jail for his brush with revenge. But instead of setting Eric straight, this stint behind bars only seemed to drive him further in the wrong direction. He began saving the newspaper clippings from articles about his crimes. These not only served as some sort of trophy for Eric, but he also used them in a misguided attempt to connect with people. He'd show them off and brag about his crimes, and then he didn't seem to understand why people weren't lining up to be his friend afterward. His crimes began to escalate further. Now, instead of vandalism and arson, Eric had moved on to breaking and entering and larceny. He'd sneak into people's houses in the middle of the night, usually stealing anything he thought had any value, but sometimes he broke in just to make a point. If someone had wronged him, Eric would break into their home and damage the property, usually either their clothing or their furniture, as an act of revenge. It wasn't difficult for the police to track down who was behind these sprees of break-ins, especially when Eric often bragged about the crimes to people that he hardly knew. Fingerprints placed him at even more crime scenes, and Eric was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Released at the age of 21, Eric had now grown into a young man. He was short and slight, with dark, wavy hair. He still had a slightly disfigured mouth and speech impediment, but he'd also finally found the place that he wanted to be. Eric joined the Army. He did well and quickly began to rise up the ranks to Lance Corporal, but his past came back to haunt him. A background check uncovered Eric's criminal record, and Eric was discharged. A year later, he met 19-year-old Sarah Lavin and quickly tied the knot. Together, they went on to have 7 children, but somehow his turn of luck was too little too late for Eric's journey in life. By day, Eric played the role of a family man, but by night, he returned to the familiar hunting ground of the streets. He stole cars, and because many people during the 50s and 60s in Australia often left their keys in the ignition, Eric sometimes brought the stolen cars right back to where he'd found them. Car owners would wake up the next morning to find their cars parked exactly where they left them, unaware that Eric had taken them for a joyride during the night. Eric was only caught after he'd been involved in a crash in 1955. The crash had been so severe that Eric needed to be taken to the hospital, and it was there that his long spree of car theft and joyriding came to an end. He was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor, but it was only after this stint behind bars that Eric realized that he'd been making things easy for investigators. After that, he took to wearing gloves whenever he was involved in criminal activity, and when he was released early around Christmas of 1956, Eric got right back to work. The break-ins, thefts, arsons, and revenge all continued, but unfortunately for many in Australia, Eric's crimes graduated to another level again. In the early hours of January 27, 1963, a suburb of Perth woke up to the sound of gunshots. A couple sitting in a parked car managed to get away from the unknown shooter and survive their wounds, but the same could not be said for the other victims that day. A man asleep in a nearby apartment was killed by a single gunshot wound to the head. An 18-year-old student asleep on the porch of a boarding house was also killed by a single gunshot wound to the head. A retired grocer answered the front door of his house only the next street over and was also killed with a single gunshot wound to the head. Perth fell into a deep panic. Residents strengthened the security around their homes by replacing locks and buying dogs. But this particular killer was very familiar with the streets, and he'd been paying attention to how police investigators worked. Now, instead of following the same MO and bragging about his crimes, Eric kept switching things up and covering his tracks. But maybe most importantly, he kept quiet. Instead, he found new ways to flaunt his crimes to the world. After stabbing one of his victims, he tested fate by stopping to drink a lemonade on the victim's porch. Another time, he strangled a victim with a cord from a bedside lamp before sexually assaulting the victim's remains. He then stripped them and dragged the body outside onto a neighbor's lawn, where he penetrated them with an empty whiskey bottle. When he finally left the scene, he placed that bottle between the victim's arms. For years, his crimes went unchecked. In fact, the police ended up tying 2 of his murders to 2 other suspects, and Eric was left to roam free. It was only after the murder of another 18-year-old student who died from a single gunshot wound to the head that the authorities honed in on Eric. They discovered the murder weapon which had been ditched near the crime scene. But instead of picking it up and collecting it as evidence, the police replaced it with a decoy weapon and waited. Eric eventually showed up, trying to hide the evidence, but instead, he'd ended up handing himself over to the investigators. At first, Eric tried to play things cool, and claimed to have nothing to do with the spree of murders that had now lasted for 4 years. Annoyed and frustrated with Eric's constant denials, a detective named Max Baker told Eric, quote, "Cookie, you're going to hang. There's no doubt about it. You've got a wife and kids. Think of them, and then think about whether you're going to be dragged to the gallows like a mongrel dog, or you're going to go there like a man." The message seemed to hit home. After that, it was like the seal had been broken, and Eric confessed to everything. He recounted the murders, his arsons, and even went into great detail on over 200 counts of theft. He even confessed to 2 of the killings that had been attributed to 2 other men, although the jury is still out on whether he really committed those himself or was bragging in an attempt to impress people and make friends again. But regardless, Eric soon found himself in court where his defense lawyers argued not guilty by reason of insanity. They claimed that Eric had schizophrenia, and given his long history of head injuries and possible brain damage, they could have been onto something. The director of the state mental health services, however, testified that Eric was sane, and the state refused to let Eric be seen by independent psychiatrists. As far as the courts were concerned, Eric was sane, and he was found guilty of murder. His sentence, to be hanged by the neck until dead. Eric refused to appeal the verdict, and his sentence was carried out about a year later in October 1964. He was the last person to be hanged in Western Australia before they later outlawed the death penalty. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and let me take a minute to say thank you. I completely realize that it's all up to you how you spend your time, what you listen to. And Lord knows there are hundreds and thousands of podcasts out there, probably millions. And true crime makes up the large bulk of that. And of all of those podcasts, you right now are listening to mine. And that's not lost on me. I truly do appreciate it. Now, that being said, let me let you know that it's kind of slowing down. I'm usually getting like a steady supply of cases to talk about on this podcast in my email. Just like boom, 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 just a bunch of them. And I look into every single one that I have the time to look into and then, whittle it down from there, the ones that I can turn into a 10-minute episode. I'm still getting them, obviously, but they're slowing down. They're not as many as there used to be. So I need that to crank back up. Maybe if you've sent one before, send another one. That's cool. joe@10minutemurder.com is the email address. joe@10minutemurder.com. And if you're driving or something, you don't want to write that down, later on, just go to 10minutemurder.com and you can submit it that way. All right, that's going to do it. That is your episode for today. And again, I'm truly grateful for the number of people that listen to this podcast. I put a lot of time and effort into it. And the fact that so many of you enjoy it and listen to it and share it with your friends and family, I'm truly grateful. Thank you.